Sisters, and today we are going to be starting a new series, I Survived. I don't know if you've ever heard of the series I Survived before, but if you've never heard of them, check them out. You need to. They are the best-selling series in history, and I actually just found out about them, and I've only read 0 of the I Survived books, and I'm going to check out the first one that Lauren Tarshis ever wrote, and you guys are going to explore with me what happens in this particular book, because I don't know what's going to happen, but I have never read The Sinking of the Titanic before, and I really hope that it's a good book. And if you have this book at home, you could follow along with me. Okay, so we are going to read The Sinking of the Titanic, which is probably one of the mainest ones ever. I'm going to read 10 chapters, and I was so excited to get these I Survived books. So I'm going to read them in order. So after this, I'm going to read the shark attacks, which you guys are probably scared of. So I'm going to read 10 chapters now. It's a little bit late. It's kind of like 7:30-ish. So I'm going to read 10 chapters tonight and 9 chapters tomorrow. And then I'll start the shark attacks on Monday. All right. I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic, 1912. Chapter 1. Monday, April 15th, 1912, 2 o'clock a.m. On the deck of RMS Titanic. The Titanic was sinking. The gigantic ship had hit an iceberg. Land was far, far away. 10-year-old George Calder stood on the deck. He shivered because the night was freezing cold, and because he was scared, more scared than he'd ever been before. More scared than when Papa swore he'd send George to the army school, far from everything and everyone. More scared even than the time the Black Panther chased him through the woods back home in Millerstone, New York. The deck of the Titanic was packed with people. Some were running and shouting, "Help us! Take my baby! Jump!" Some just plain screamed. Children cried. A gunshot exploded across the deck, but George didn't move. "Just hold on," he told himself, gripping the rail like maybe he could hold up the ship. He couldn't look down at that black water. He kept his eyes on the sky. He had never seen so many stars. Papa said that Mama watched over him from heaven. Could Mama see him now? The ship lurched. "We're going down," a man shouted. George closed his eyes, praying this was all a dream. Even more terrible sounds filled the air. Glass shattering, furniture crashing, more screams and cries, a bellowing sound like a giant beast was dying a terrible death. George tried to hold the rail, but he lost his grip. He tumbled, smashing his head on the deck. And then George couldn't see anything. Even the stars above him seemed to go black. Chapter 2. 19 hours earlier, Sunday, April 14th, 1912, 7:15 a.m., First Class Suite, B Deck, RMS Titanic. George woke up early that morning, half expecting to hear Papa calling him for George. But then he remembered the Titanic. He was on the greatest ship in the world. It was their 5th day at sea. George and his 8-year-old sister, Phoebe, had spent 2 months in England with their Aunt Daisy. What a time they had! As a surprise for George's 10th birthday, Aunt Daisy took him to see the Tower of London, where they used to chop off your head if the king didn't like you. Now they were heading back to America, back to Papa and their little farm in upstate New York. George got out of bed and knelt by the small round window that looked out on the ocean. "Morning," said Phoebe, peering through the silk curtains of her bed and fumbling for her spectacles. Her curly brown hair was practically standing straight up. "What were you looking for?" George had to smile. Phoebe always had a question, even at the crack of dawn. Maybe that's why she was the smartest little sister in the world. "I thought I saw a giant squid," George said, "and it's coming to get us." George rushed over and grabbed Phoebe with wiggly squid arms. She curled up into a ball and laughed. She was still laughing when Aunt Daisy came in, even in her robe and slippers. Aunt Daisy was the prettiest lady on the whole ship. Sometimes George couldn't believe she was so old. 22. "What's this?" Aunt Daisy said. "You know the rule. No having fun without me." Phoebe sat up and put her arms around George. "Georgie said he saw a giant squid." Aunt Daisy laughed. "I wouldn't doubt it. Everyone wants to get a look at the Titanic, even sea monsters." George halfway believed it. He never imagined anything like the Titanic. Aunt Daisy called the ship a floating palace, but it was way better than the cold and dusty castles they'd seen in England. They had 3 whole rooms, one for Phoebe and George, one for Aunt Daisy, and one for sitting around and doing nothing. They even had a man, a steward named Henry. He had bright red hair and an Irish accent that made everything he said sound like a jolly song. "Some fresh towels for your bath," he would say, "some cocoa before bed," and just before they turned out the lights for the night, Henry would knock on their door and peep his head in. "Is there anything else you might need?" he'd ask. George kept trying to think of something he needed. But what could you ever need on the Titanic? The ship had everything, even a swimming pool with ocean water heated up like a bath, even cold silk curtains for your bed so you could pretend you were sleeping in a pirate's den, even 3 dining rooms where you could eat anything you wanted. Last night, George had eaten 2 plates of roast beef, veal and ham pie, carrots sweet as candy, in a mysterious dessert called Mergenny pudding. It tastes like sugary clouds. Actually, there was one thing missing from the Titanic, the New York Giants baseball team. George wondered what Henry would say if George said, "I need shortstop Artie Fletcher right away." Probably Henry would say, "Coming right up, sir." George grinned just thinking about it. But Aunt Daisy wasn't smiling at him. She looked very serious. "We have to make the most of our last 3 days at sea," Aunt Daisy said in a low voice. "I want you to promise me, George, no more trouble." George gulped. Was she really still mad at him for last night? He'd slid down the banister of the grand staircase in the first-class lobby. How could he resist? The wood was so shiny and polished, curving around like a ride at the fair. "That lady could have moved out of the way," George said. "How could she?" Phoebe said. "She was wearing 100 pounds of diamonds." Aunt Daisy almost smiled. George could tell. No, she could never stay mad at George for long. Aunt Daisy put her face very close to George's. She had freckles on her nose, just like George and Phoebe. "No more trouble," she repeated, tapping his chest. "I don't want to have to send a telegram to your father." George's stomach tightened into a baseball. "Don't tell Papa," Phoebe said. "He'll send George away to that army school." "I'll be good," George promised. "I will, really." "You better be," Aunt Daisy said. Chapter 3. George didn't mean to get into trouble. It's just that he got these great ideas, like on their first day at sea when he had climbed up the huge ladder into the crow's nest. "Aunt Daisy!" he yelled, waving his arms. She had looked up, and she'd almost fainted. And yesterday George had explored the entire ship. Aunt Daisy kept warning him that he'd get lost. She said the ship was like a maze, but George could always find his way. Even in the huge forest that stretched out behind their farm. Mama used to say that George had a map of the world behind his eyes. He saw the engine rooms and the boiler rooms and wound up on the third-class recreation deck. He was watching some boys play marbles when he noticed that he wasn't alone. A little boy was staring up at him with huge eyes the color of amberglass. "See," the boy said, "see." And he held out a postcard of the Statue of Liberty. He looked so proud, like he'd carved that big lady himself. George felt like he had to show something in return. So he took out his good luck charm, the boning knife Papa had given him for his 9th birthday. He let the little boy run his fingers across the handle, which was carved from an elk's antler. "Enzo," the little boy said, puffing out his chest and pointing to himself. "George," said George. "Giorgio!" the little boy cried with a smile. A man sitting near them laughed. He was reading an Italian-English dictionary and had the same huge eyes as the boy. George guessed right that he was Enzo's father. "Marco," he said, shaking George's hand, "you are our first American friend." Marco must have been studying that dictionary pretty hard, because George understood everything he said. George learned that Enzo was 4 years old. He'd lost his mama, too. He and Marco came from a little town in Italy, and now they were moving to New York City. George told Marco about their farm and their trip and explained that any decent person living in New York had to be a Giants fan. For some reason, Marco thought that was funny. When it was time for George to leave, Enzo got upset. Very upset. "Giorgio!" he howled, loud enough for the whole entire ship to hear. People stared and put their hands over their ears. Marco promised that they'd see George again, but Enzo wouldn't quit howling. George had never heard anything so loud. By the time Enzo let go of George's leg and George ran back up to the suite, Aunt Daisy was practically howling too. "I thought you fell overboard," she cried. But even then, she wasn't really mad. She didn't get really mad until last night. How that lady screamed when George came sliding down the banister, like he really was a giant squid. George didn't mind getting yelled at. He was used to it. Not a day at school went by without Mr. Lander shouting, "George, settle down." And Papa, well, he always seemed to be mad at George, but not Aunt Daisy. And being on this trip was supposed to make her happy. Happy for the first time since her husband died last year. It had been Uncle Cliff's dream to be on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. He'd struck it rich selling automobiles and had plenty of money to pay for one of the biggest suites on the ship. When Uncle Cliff had his accident, George was sure Aunt Daisy would cancel the trip. Instead, she'd invited George and Phoebe to go with her. And to George's shock, Papa said they could. "Your aunt's going on this trip to find a little peace," he'd said to George. "I expect you to be a perfect gentleman." And if he wasn't, George knew he'd be shipped off to that army school for sure. Papa had been talking about that place ever since George had brought the 2-foot rat snake to school to show Mr. Landers because they were studying reptiles. George had been perfect the whole time in England. He let Aunt Daisy drag him to a fancy clothes store for a new pair of boots. He even learned to drink tea without spitting it back into the cup. But, well, the Titanic. The ship gave him so many great ideas, but now he'd really be perfect. No more ideas for the rest of the voyage. Chapter 4. Phoebe wasn't taking any chances with George. "I'm not letting you out of my sight," she announced after they'd finished breakfast. "I'm your guardian angel." "I didn't know angels wore spectacles," he said, tugging on one of Phoebe's curls. "The smart ones do," Phoebe said, grabbing George's arm. She offered him a lemon drop from the little silver tin she'd been carrying around since London. George made a face. He hated those old lady candies. George wanted to go find Marco and Enzo and hear more about Italy. He wanted to ride the elevators up and down. Hardly any other ship in the world had elevators. Better yet, he wanted to find Mr. Andrews, the ship's designer. When Mr. Andrews had stopped by their table at dinner the first night, George thought he was just another boring millionaire coming over to kiss Aunt Daisy's hand. But Mr. Andrews was different. "You built the Titanic?" said George. Mr. Andrews smiled. "Not by myself. It took thousands of men to build her, but I did design her, that's true." He invited George and Phoebe to come with him to the first-class writing room. He unrolled the ship's blueprints across a long, polished table. It was like looking at the skeleton of a giant beast. "She's the biggest moving object ever built," Mr. Andrews explained. 11 stories tall, 45,000 tons of steel, and longer than 40 city blocks. "Our aunt says nothing bad can happen to this ship," Phoebe said. "People say it's unsinkable." "No ship is safer," Mr. Andrews said. "That is certainly true." "What if the Titanic was hit by a meteor?" said Phoebe, whose latest obsession was outer space. She was determined to see a shooting star before they docked in New York. Mr. Andrews didn't laugh or roll his eyes like Mr. Landers did when Phoebe asked her questions. "I hadn't planned on any meteors hitting the ship," Mr. Andrews said thoughtfully, "but I'd like to think she could take almost anything and still float." Phoebe seemed satisfied. "Are there any secret passages?" said George. Phoebe stared at the boats and shrugged. "I guess you're right," she said, and then she announced that it was time to see how many ladies were wearing hats with blue feathers. George groaned. This would be the most boring day of his life, but at least nobody was yelling at him. Chapter 5. At dinner that night, Aunt Daisy raised her glass to George. No trouble for one entire day. They clinked their glasses together just as an old man stopped by their table. "Mrs. Key," the man said to Aunt Daisy, "I've been meaning to say hello." "Mr. Stead," Aunt Daisy said, "what a pleasure. This is George, my nephew, and Phoebe, my niece." Mr. Stead nodded hello. "So," Aunt Daisy said, "what brings you on to this magnificent ship?" "Oh, I couldn't miss it," he said. "I think all of our society is on this ship. I hear there's even an Egyptian princess on board." "Really?" Aunt Daisy said. "I haven't met her." "Well, none of us have. She's traveling in the first-class baggage room." "Excuse me," Aunt Daisy said. "The princess is more than 2,500 years old?" Mr. Stead said. George's ears perked up. "I'm not sure I understand," Aunt Daisy said. "She's a mummy," Mr. Stead said. "A mummy?" Phoebe gasped. "That's right," Mr. Stead said. "From a tomb near Thames. I understand she belongs to a man named Mr. Burroughs. People are saying he sold the coffin to the British Museum. Then he packed the princess herself in a wooden crate. Apparently, he's bringing her back for his collection. Some say it's bad luck to take a mummy from its tomb. I'm glad I'm not the superstitious type," Aunt Daisy said. Mr. Stead chuckled. "In any case, nothing can harm this ship, not even the curse of a mummy." Mr. Stead tipped his hat and said goodbye. "Mr. Stead is a very famous writer in England," Aunt Daisy said. "You never know who you'll meet on the Titanic." And then it hit George, the best idea ever. That mummy! He had to see it. Maybe this day wasn't so boring after all. Chapter 6. George didn't tell Phoebe or Aunt Daisy about his plan. He figured he'd head down to the first-class baggage room after they went to sleep. He'd find Mr. Burroughs' crate, pry it open, and take a quick peek at that mummy. He'd be back in bed and snoring away before anyone knew he was gone. It was almost 11:15 when Phoebe was finally asleep and the light was out under Aunt Daisy's door. George crept out of bed. He quickly got dressed and put his knife in his pocket. He needed it for prying off the lid of the crate. And who knew? Maybe there was a live cobra in the box too. George could hope. Couldn't he? George opened the door and peeked into the hallway. He wanted to avoid Henry, who seemed to have eyes in the back of his bright orange head. He wouldn't like George creeping around so late at night. But the hallway was quiet. There was no noise at all except for the quiet hum of the engines. Rising up from the bottom of the ship, George loved that noise. It made him think of crickets in the woods at night. In fact, being out here all by himself reminded him of the nights at home when he sneaked out into the woods while Papa and Phoebe were asleep. He'd head out when his mind was filled with restless thoughts about why Papa was always mad at him or why he didn't try harder in school. And of course, Mama. Almost 3 years had passed since she died. George tried not to think about her too much, but some nights when he closed his eyes, he'd remember her smile, or her smell when she hugged him close, like fresh grass and sweet flowers, and that song she'd sing to wake George up in the morning. Awake, awake, it's now daybreak, but don't forget your dreams. Thinking about Mama was like standing close to a fire. Warm at first, but get too close and it hurt too much. Much better to stay clear of those thoughts. Nothing cleared George's mind quicker than being in the woods. He never stayed out for more than an hour or two, except for that night back in October. George was heading back toward home when he heard a terrible sound, like a little girl screaming. He turned around, and in the dark distance he saw 2 glowing yellow eyes. Some old-timers said there were black panthers in the woods, but George never believed it. But as the yellow eyes got closer, George could see the outline of a huge cat with 2 glistening fangs. George told himself not to run. He knew he'd never outrun the panther, but he couldn't help it. He ran as fast as he could. Branches cut his face, but he didn't slow down. Any second, the panther would leap up and tackle George. Its claws would tear him apart. George could feel the cat right behind him. He could smell its breath, like rotten meat. George grabbed a fallen branch. He turned and waved it in front of him. The panther lunged and grabbed the branch in its jaws. George let go of the stick and scrambled up a tree, climbing as high as he could go. The cat dropped the branch and came after him, like a shadow with glowing eyes. George pulled out his knife. He waited until the cat's front paws were on the small branch just below him, and then with all his might he chopped at the branch with his knife. Crack! The branch broke free. The giant cat tumbled through the air, screaming and crashing through the branches, and then hit the ground with a thud. There was silence. And then the cat stood up. It looked up at George for a long moment, and it turned and walked slowly back into the woods. George stayed in the tree until it was just about light, and made it into bed just before Papa woke up. His friends at school refused to believe George when he told them, even when he swore in his heart. No way, big fat lie. Next thing you'll be saying is that you've been signed by the giants. Their laughter rose up around George, but it didn't bother him because right then he realized that it didn't matter what they thought. George knew he'd face down the panther, and he'd never forget it. Chapter 7. Just thinking about seeing the mummy made George happy. He went down 5 flights of stairs to G-deck and practically skipped along the long hallway toward the front of the ship. He ducked into doorways a few times to hide from the night stewards, but he had no trouble finding his way, not like Phoebe, who got lost walking from the dining room to the washroom. Next time I'll leave a trail of breadcrumbs, like Hansel and Gretel. She'd said their first day on board. How about lemon drops, George had suggested. Phoebe had giggled. The hold was in the very front of the ship, past the mail sorting room, in the cabins where the stokers and firemen stayed. Too bad, George thought, that there wasn't time to sneak in and see the escape ladders. Luckily, there were 2 more days at sea. George walked right through the doors of the first-class baggage room and down a steep metal staircase that led to the hold. All around him were crates and trucks and bags neatly stacked on shelves and lined up on the floor. It took him a minute to figure out that everything was arranged in alphabetical order by the owners' names, and a few minutes to find the bees. And there it was, a plain wooden crate stamped with the words, Mr. David Burroughs, New York City, contents, fragile. George smiled to himself. This was going to be easy. He took out his knife and started to pry off the lid. He worked carefully, prying each nail loose so he'd be able to close the crate tight again when he was finished. He made it halfway around when he heard a strange sound. The hair on his arms prickled. It was the same feeling he'd had the night of the panther, that someone or something was watching him. George stared at the crate, his heart pounding. And before he could even take a breath, something leaped out of the shadows and pushed him to the ground. George looked up, half expecting to see a mummy rising out of the crate, her arms reaching for George's throat. What he saw was almost as horrifying. It was a man with glittering blue eyes and a scar running down the side of his face. He grabbed George's knife out of his hand. The man was small but very strong. I'll take this, he said, admiring it. Then he looked George up and down. So, the man said, trying to fill your pockets with some first-class loot. George realized he must be a robber. George had caught him in the act. No, The man pointed to George's boots. Which trunk did you steal those from? Cost more than a third-class ticket, I'd say. George shook his head. I got them in London, he said, and too late realized he'd made a mistake. A prince from first class, the man said with a hearty laugh. Just down here for a little thrill. What's your name? George, said George softly. Prince George, the man said, bowing in a joking way. A pity those boots wouldn't fit me, he added, standing up. But you do have something I'd like. Your key. Always wanted to see one of those first-class cabins. There was no way George could let this man up to the suite. He jumped overboard before he let him near Aunt Daisy and Phoebe. There's a mummy down here, he blurted out. It's worth millions. It's in that crate. The man raised an eyebrow. George kept talking. I thought I could sneak it off the ship and sell it in New York, George lied. My father's business is bad. I thought if I could sell it. The man looked at the crate. I like the way you think, he said. He waved the knife at George and told him not to move, and then he quickly worked the knife around the lid. Obviously, he'd done this many times before. He lifted the lid off the crate, but before either of them could look inside, there was a tremendous rumbling noise, and the entire hole began to shake so hard that George almost fell. The shaking got stronger and stronger, the noise louder and louder, like thunder exploding all around them. A trunk tumbled off a shelf and hit the scar-faced man on the head. The knife clattered to the floor, but George didn't try to get it. Here was his chance to escape. He spun around, ran up the stairs, and darted out the door. Chapter 8. George ran as fast as he could down the hall. He heard shouting behind him, but he didn't stop until he was back on B deck, safe again in first class. A steward hurried past him with a stack of clean towels. Good evening, sir, he said. George nodded, out of breath. Nothing could happen to him up here, he knew. So why was his heart still pounding? It was the ship, he realized. That thundering noise, that shaking in the hold. Had a boiler exploded? Had a steam pipe burst? An eerie silence surrounded him, and George's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the engines had been turned off. The quiet rumbling had stopped. Just outside, George heard people talking loudly. Did they know what was happening? George went out onto the deck and walked over to the small crowd of men. Most were still dressed in their dinner tuxedos and puffing on cigars. They were standing at the rail, pointing and laughing at something happening on the well deck. One level below, what was so funny? George squeezed between two men and looked over the rail. At first, he was sure his eyes were playing tricks. It looked like the well deck had been through a winter storm. It was covered with ice and slush. A bunch of young men in tattered coats and hats were pelting each other with balls of ice, roaring with laughter like kids having a snowball fight. "What's happened?" asked a man who'd walked up behind George. "The ship nudged an iceberg," said an old man with a bushy mustache. He didn't sound worried. "An iceberg? Is that why they've stopped the engines?" said the new man. "Because of some ice on the deck. Just being cautious, it seems, following regulations," said the older fellow. "I spoke to one of the officers. He assured me we'll be underway any moment." "Hey there," he yelled down to the young men below. "Toss some of that ice up here." One of the gang picked up a piece of ice the size of a baseball. He threw it, but the man with the bushy mustache missed. George reached out and made a clean catch with one hand. The crowd cheered. George held up the ice and smiled. Then he held it out to the man. "Keep it, son," he said. "There's plenty for everyone." The piece of ice was heavier than George had expected. He sniffed it and wrinkled his nose. It smelled like old sardines. More ice balls came sailing up from below, and the men jostled to catch them. Their laughter and cheers rose up around George, and the fear he'd felt in the baggage hold faded away. From up here on the deck of this incredible ship, George felt powerful. Nothing could hurt him on the Titanic. Not a meteor falling from space, not a giant squid, not the scar-faced man. George squinted out into the distance, hoping to see the iceberg, but the sea faded into darkness. His teeth were chattering now. It was so much colder than it had been at dinner time. He wanted to be back in bed, curled up under his fancy first-class sheets and blankets. The corridor was still quiet as George crept toward his suite. As he was letting himself in, he stepped on something that made a crunching sound under his boot. At first, George thought it was his ice or a piece of glass. But when he picked up his heel, he saw that the carpet was covered with yellow crystals. George smiled. It was just one of Phoebe's lemon drops. George let himself in, easing the door shut. Phoebe's bed curtains were closed. The light under Aunt Daisy's door was off. George quickly changed into his pajamas and climbed into bed. Yes, he was safe, he told himself. He tried to go to sleep, but as the minutes ticked by, his mind got restless. It hit him that his knife was gone, forever, and the total silence of the ship seemed to press down on him. Why hadn't the engine started up again? He lay wide awake, listening and wondering. It was almost a relief when he heard someone knocking on the door. Chapter 9. It was Henry. "Hello, George," said Henry. "Can I speak to Mrs. Key, please?" Henry wore his usual polite smile, but his voice wasn't jolly. "What is it?" said Aunt Daisy, stepping out of her room. "So sorry to barge in like this, ma'am," Henry said, "but there's been an incident." Aunt Daisy glared at George. "I'm so sorry, Henry," she said in an exasperated voice. "My nephew here just can't seem to stay out of trouble." "Oh, no, ma'am," Henry exclaimed. "This has nothing to do with George. It's the ship, ma'am. Seems we bumped an iceberg. I'm sure the captain is just being curious. But he wants everyone up on deck." "It's after midnight," Aunt Daisy said with a laugh. "Surely the captain doesn't expect us to appear on deck in our night clothes." "No, ma'am, it's very cold outside." Henry walked over to the dresser and brought out 3 life jackets. "And you'll need to put these on, over your coats." Aunt Daisy stared at the life jackets as if Henry was holding up clown costumes. "Henry, I'm not taking the children out into the cold for some kind of drill. Has Captain Smith lost his senses?" "Of course not, Mrs. Key," Henry said. Now, if you could get yourself and the children ready, I'll be back in just a moment to see if you need any help." He left them alone. "All right, George," Aunt Daisy said. "I guess we'll have another adventure to boast about when we get back. You get dressed. I'll get Phoebe up." Aunt Daisy went to Phoebe's bed, pulling aside the curtains. George heard a gasp, and he rushed over. Phoebe wasn't there. "Where could she be?" Aunt Daisy exclaimed. A cold feeling crept up George's spine. Phoebe, his guardian angel. She must have woken up while George was gone, and now she was somewhere on the ship, searching for George. He took a deep breath. "I went out exploring," George said, "after you went to bed. I didn't think Phoebe would wake up. She never does." "So she's out there looking for you?" Aunt Daisy said. George nodded. "She doesn't want me getting into trouble." He kept his eyes glued to the floor. Aunt Daisy should be furious with him, and Papa was right. George had no sense. Not one lick of sense. How would they ever find Phoebe? But then George had an idea. That lemon drop in the hallway. Could it be? He ran out into the corridor, which was still empty. It seemed Henry wasn't having much luck getting people out of bed and up onto the deck. George ran a little ways down the hall. There! He hurried down a bit farther. Yes, another lemon drop. Phoebe, his smart sister. Aunt Daisy came up behind him. "She's left a trail of lemon drops," George said. Aunt Daisy looked confused. "Like Hansel and Gretel," George explained. "She left a trail so she could find her way back." Chapter 10. George and Aunt Daisy scrambled to get dressed and put on their life jackets. Aunt Daisy brought Phoebe's warmest coat, and George carried the extra life jacket. They'd quickly find Phoebe and head up to the boat deck. And tomorrow morning, this would be a big joke to laugh at over breakfast. George thought that Phoebe had gone to the promenade deck, that she'd been woken up by the commotion with the ice, and figured that George had gone out to see what was happening. But when they got to the main staircase, he saw that the yellow glints were headed downstairs, not up to the deck. His heart sank. Phoebe had headed down to the first-class baggage hold because she knew that George would want to see that mummy. Of course she'd known. Phoebe could read his mind. A chill went through George's bones. What if the scar-faced man was lurking in the baggage hold when Phoebe got there? He ran faster down the stairs now. Aunt Daisy called after him, but he didn't slow down. But when he got down to G-deck, there was a gate stretched across the doorway. "This wasn't here when I came down," he said to Aunt Daisy. He tried to pull it open, but it was locked. And just on the other side, there was a mob of people standing restlessly. Third-class passengers from the looks of their worn clothing. "Look," Aunt Daisy said, pointing at one of Phoebe's candies glinting on the floor on the other side of the gate pushed next to the wall. "She's down here." "Pardon me," she called to the steward standing in front of the crowd. "You've gone the wrong way, madam," he said, staring at Aunt Daisy's huge diamond ring. "The captain wants first-class passengers up on the boat deck now." "My niece is down here somewhere," Aunt Daisy said. "You need to let us through." "I'm sure she wouldn't have wandered down this far," the steward said. "We're quite sure she's down here," Aunt Daisy said. "So if you'll please open the gate." "I'm sorry, madam," he said. "Regulations." "Open this gate at once," Aunt Daisy shouted in a tone George had never heard her use before. The man took a key from his pocket and opened the gate. He stepped aside to let them pass. The crowd surged forward. "Get back," the steward shouted. "We'll tell you when it's time for you to go up." A few of the men lunged toward him. Aunt Daisy grabbed George's arm. The steward took a pistol from his pocket. His hand shook as he waved it toward the crowd. George and Aunt Daisy stepped through the gate. The steward slammed it behind them. They were trapped down there, just like everyone else. George and Aunt Daisy squeezed through the crowd, weaving around trucks and stepping over sleeping children. There were so many people. If Phoebe's candies were down here, they couldn't see them anymore. Suddenly something crashed into George from behind. A pair of arms wrapped around his waist so tightly he couldn't breathe. George's heart stopped. The scar-faced man! Giorgio! Enzo screamed up at him. George's eardrums nearly split in two. Enzo's father hurried over to them. He tried to gently peel Enzo away from George, but the little boy wouldn't let go. "No!" he howled. "No!" "Very sorry," Marco said, smiling apologetically at Aunt Daisy, who looked more confused than ever. "We are old friends of Giorgio." George started to introduce Aunt Daisy, but before he could get 3 words out, Enzo was dragging him down the hall, elbowing his way through the crowd like a pin-sized bull. "See, see," Enzo said. "What?" George said. "No! See, see." What was this kid doing? What did he want George to see? The answer was just a few steps away through an open doorway. It was the mail sorting room, except now all George could see was water, green water swirling halfway up the stairs, foaming and churning like a stormy river. Sacks of mail bobbed up and down. Hundreds of letters floated on the surface. And now George understood what Enzo was saying. See! The sea! The Titanic was filling with water from the sea. All right, well, I just read the first 10 chapters of I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic, 1912. So that was a long chapters, and I don't even know what time it is. Let's see. Oh my god, it's already 8:05. I started the video like 7:30-ish. Okay, so we know that George, Phoebe, and his Aunt Daisy are on the Titanic for a little trip. But George wanted to go out and explore and see if he could see the mummy that that Mr. Stead had told him about. And then when he came back, he heard that incident about the Titanic. Whoa, excuse me. And then he was thinking that Phoebe had run away because he noticed that George wasn't there, and she went out to find him. And then now they haven't found Phoebe yet. So I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder if they're going to find Phoebe or if they're not going to find Phoebe. So I hope, just cross your fingers that they find Phoebe. We will find out tomorrow when we read chapters 11 through 19. So we left off when they were in this big room where they thought that Phoebe was, but they met Enzo and Marco, their new friends. So make sure that you stay tuned in for tomorrow, really early in the morning. I'll be posting the video of the last 9 chapters of I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic. I hope you enjoyed the first 10 chapters. Bye-bye. Make sure that you tune in back tomorrow, Sunday, April 10th, 2022.